All right, now we're going to tie a beadhead Prince Nymph. This slide's got a few little tricks as well. So we're going to start with a Tiemco 5262, and we've got a tungsten bead on the front of here just to keep this slide down along the bottom. We're going to use some biot black thread, brown goose biots for the tail, peacock curl for the body, gold oval tinsel for the rib, a brown hen hackle feather for the collar, and some white biots for the horns at the front of the fly. Pretty standard recipe. No tricks there. We're going to add a little bit of lead wire to help center this bead and keep the fly down a little in the water column. So I'm going to take some 15 thousandths lead wire, and I'll make 8 or 10 turns. Break off the ends. Try to break those as flush as I can, and I'll push that lead right up into the back edge of the bead to help center it. And I'm going to start the thread right behind where I tied that lead off. Now I'm going to build just a little bit of a taper from the bare shank up to the diameter of the lead. I'm going to spiral wrap the thread up over the lead and back again, just to smooth that off a bit, and I'll come back to the bend. Now this is where we're going to do the biot tails, and there's a couple little tricks here as well. I'm going to select out 2 biots, and I'm going to tie these in with them opposed. So right now they're both curving the same direction. So the trick to getting these opposed is I'm going to turn my hand over and grab the near biot, and then turn my hand back over, and I can place these back to back where I'll end up with the biots curving away from each other. So that's the easy way to get the biots opposed. And then I can kind of slide my fingers up and down to get their tips even. Once I'm happy that the tips are even, I'm going to measure these against the hook shank so they're about 1/2 shank long. I'll transfer them to my material hand, and I'm going to place them with the butt ends on either side of the hook shank. I'm going to tilt these just slightly toward me so they're not straight up in line with the hook shank, but rather slightly canted off to the side. I'm going to take a turn of thread up and over, and I'm going to draw the thread toward me as I tighten that loop, and that will let those biots slide to top dead center on the hook and square them up. I can control how much spread there is on those biots by the direction I pull and how hard I pull on the thread. Once I've got those anchored in place, I'm going to wrap forward over the butt ends, in this case just to the end of that thread taper, and I'll trim those off. Now I'm going to take my gold tinsel, and this is oval tinsel, so it's not a metal tinsel. I'm going to move my thread up to just behind the bead. I'll tie the tinsel in, and I'm going to wrap back over it to the bend. And I'll tuck that back in my material clip for the time being. Now we're going to build the body. I'm going to take 1/2 or so strung peacock curls here. I'm going to trim the tips so that they're square. I'm going to run my thread forward again. The reason I don't want to tie these in at the back on a small fly like this is I'll end up with a lump that will show through the overbody. I want to tie it in at the front so I've got a consistent diameter underbody from the front of the shank to the back. So I'll tie this in just behind the bead, wrap back over those curls to the base of the tail, and bring my thread forward right back up to the back edge of the bead again. Now I'm going to wrap my peacock curls around the hook, and we're going to build a slightly tapered body here as we go. I'm going to tie that peacock curl off at the back edge of the bead and trim the stubs. Now I'm going to spiral wrap my ribbing forward through the peacock curl. Now this is pretty apparent ribbing when I wrap this faceted tinsel through, so I'm not going to go real heavy on the rib. I might only go 3 or 4 turns up to the back edge of the bead, and I'll tie that off. And like I say, this is not metal tinsel, so I can cut it with my scissors. And now I'm ready for my hackle collar. I'm going to take a hen feather. This is a hen neck feather, which is more appropriately sized for a smaller fly like this. I want hackle fibers that are about 1.5 to 2 times the hook gap. I'm going to trim the bottom half of the feather out. I'm going to get up out of that narrow stem, and I'm going to trim the barbs off the base of this feather, leaving just a little stubble on either side of the stem here. what that little stubble is going to do is help to anchor this feather when I tie it to the hook. We're going to fold this like a wet fly style hackle collar, and by leaving that stub, it'll make the feather a little more secure to the hook shank. So I'm going to lay this feather in just behind the bead. I'm going to capture it against the hook with several good firm tight wraps of thread. Now I've got the inside, I'm going to use this other feather to explain a little bit. I've got the inside of the feather facing toward the hook. In this case it's facing a little bit away from me, but by the time I turn it, it's going to be facing toward the hook. Now I'm going to grab the tip of this feather in my hackle pliers, and we're going to proceed to fold this feather. And by folding, what we're going to do is we're going to draw all these hackle fibers back to one side of the stem. The way to do that is I'll wet my fingers just a little bit. I'm going to close my fingers in front of the feather and draw the stem through my fingers. And you can see as I do this, I'm folding all these hackle fibers back to one side. I'll kind of just continue to work up the feather. And you can see as I'll draw down a little bit on the feather, I can kind of work both hands, one against the other, to sweep all those hackle fibers back to one side. This is going to make a nice clean hackle feather collar that all sweeps back along the body of the fly. I only need a couple of turns of feather, so I don't need to wrap the whole feather up the hook. I'm going to get 2 or 3 turns. Right about there is good. And I'll tie that feather off just behind the bead. And you can see those wraps went from right behind the bead to right behind the bead. So not a whole lot of travel there, sort of stacked up, but they are one turn right in front of the other. So we've got a narrow little hackle collar on there right now. Now I'm going to sweep this back by pushing it back along the sides of the fly and pinching it in place with my material hand. I'm going to build a little bit of a thread dam over the front edge of this hackle collar, and you can see how that'll sweep those fibers back a little more. Now we're ready to tie in our white biot horns. Now we use some narrow biots for the tail that are a little more in line with the smaller size of this fly. Because we've got a larger arbor of the hook shank up here with the lead underbody and the bead, we want a little bit wider biot for the horns. So I'm going to use the biots toward the base of the feather in the case of these white ones. I'm going to strip off 2 of these, but I'm not going to oppose them. I'm going to cross them like scissor blades, but they should both be curving down. So I'll take these and I'll crisscross them, and I want the point at which they intersect to be even with the back edge of the bead, with their tips right at the base of the tail. Not the end of the tail, just the base of the tail at the bend of the hook. I'm going to even these up just a bit more. And you can sort of see the angle at which I've got them there, about 45 degrees to each other. I'm going to lay these in on top of the hook, and I'll put my thumb down right on top of both of them. I'm going to come over the biots with the thread and anchor it with 3 or 4 good tight turns of thread so that those biots are crossed on top of the fly and in line. I'm going to use my fine tip scissors to trim these biot butts out. We're going to use our thread to cover those butt ends nice and smooth, and then whip finish right on top of the back edge of the bead. So that's a beadhead Prince nymph, one of the most common nymphs around, a great little attractor nymph, could pass for a lot of different bugs, caddis, stonefly nymphs, even mayflies. Really simple little fly. Not much variation on the theme, just a simple good little bug to have in your box.